All right, in this video I wanted to discuss some of the intricacies of the plant life cycle. And when we talk about the plant life cycle, we are really interested in how plants reproduce. So we'll go over some details and give examples of the plant life cycle from each of the four major plant groups that we'll be discussing whenever we think about plants. So, one of the details that is true for all plants is that they show this characteristic that we call alternation of generations. So this just means that plants alternate between two types of generations. And so we want to define those generations first. So the two kinds of generations that plants alternate between are first something called the sporophyte. So we're going to use this term sporophyte a lot. And the sporophyte is a diploid form of the plant. So it's 2N, it's got two copies of each chromosome. Sporophytes get their name because they produce spores. Spores are going to be a haploid form, so these spores are made by the sporophyte through the process of meiosis. You'll recall that meiosis produces haploid cells from diploid cells. So sporophytes are the part of the plant, the generation of the plant, that is diploid and produces these spores through meiosis. The other generation is the gametophyte generation. So a gametophyte is the haploid form of the organism. So this generation is haploid. And the job of the gametophyte generation is to produce gametes. You'll remember from our discussions earlier that gametes are cells like eggs and sperm that are used during sexual reproduction. We use them during fertilization to make a zygote, or a diploid organism. So the gametophyte is going to grow up from the spore. It's haploid. It's going to produce gametes, eggs and sperm, and those are going to be used during fertilization of sexual reproduction to produce another sporophyte, the diploid form. So that's how we go back and forth between these two generations in the plant life cycle. So let's look at this visually. So here's a diagram representing this alternation of generations. Again, we're going to start with this sporophyte down here at the bottom. It is diploid, or 2N. The sporophyte's job is to create spores. Here are the spores, but spores are 1N, or haploid. So in order for a diploid organism, a diploid cell, to produce a haploid cell, we need to do meiosis. Once the spores are produced, they'll be released into the environment. They will reproduce through mitosis to grow into the gametophyte. Remember, the gametophyte is still haploid, or 1N, and the gametophyte's job is to produce gametes. So here, coming out of the gametophyte, we've got gametes. Two gametes will fuse during fertilization to produce a zygote. We take two haploid cells and combine them together into a zygote. We've got a diploid cell, a 2N zygote. That zygote will reproduce through mitosis to form a new sporophyte. And so the plant life cycle alternates between sporophyte generations and gametophyte generations over and over and over again. And this is true for every kind of plant that we're going to think about in our course. So let's look at the specific life cycles of the plant groups that we're discussing in our course and think about how they differ. So before we think about how they differ, let's define the differences we're going to be looking for. So there are a few major differences between the different plant groups when it comes to this life cycle. So first, the main difference between many of the plants is which of these generations, the sporophyte or the gametophyte, is the dominant generation, which is larger in terms of the plant. We will apply terminology to the plants in this way. We'll say they're haplonic if the dominant generation is the gametophyte. We'll call it haplonic. because these cells, the gametophyte cells, are haploid, or 1N. So if the dominant generation is gametophyte, that's haploid, so we call it haplonic. We'll call them diplonic if the dominant generation is the sporophyte generation, because again, the sporophyte is diploid, or 2N. So that's one difference we'll be looking for. Which generation is dominant? Essentially, which one is larger? Right? Another difference we'll be looking for is the requirement for water. We're going to see that some plant groups absolutely require water for sexual reproduction to occur. They require water because the sperm require water to swim through to gain access to the egg. And if the environment the plant is in is too dry, there is not enough water for the sperm to ever successfully swim from where the sperm is produced to an egg. So some plants really require water for reproduction. The last characteristics we'll be looking at, thinking about the differences of, are the presence or absence of certain structures like the seeds, flowers, and fruit. Seeds, flowers, and fruit only occur in some of the plant groups. And we'll point that out as we go. So let's look more closely at this alternation of generations for each of the 4 major plant groups we're studying in this course. All right, so let's start with the bryophytes, things like mosses and liverworts. So first we're going to think about what's the dominant generation. So bryophytes are what we call haplonic. That means the haploid generation is dominant. Remember, the haploid generation is the gametophyte. So right down here at the bottom, we've got the gametophyte. This is going to be the largest part of the plant. When we observe bryophyte plants, the part that we see is the gametophyte. Remember, the gametophyte's job is to produce gametes, eggs, and sperm. They will combine together during fertilization to make a zygote, and that zygote will grow up into the sporophyte. The sporophyte is diploid, and it's here, it's growing out of the top of the gametophyte. When we look at bryophytes, this sporophyte is really small in comparison to the gametophyte. So that's why we call this, again, a haplonic organism. So again, it has a large gametophyte and a small sporophyte. That sporophyte will develop, releasing spores. Those spores will reproduce, forming the gametophyte in the next generation. All right. The other thing for us to remember about bryophytes is that bryophytes are one of these plants that absolutely requires water for reproduction. The bryophyte sperm must be able to swim from where the sperm is produced to where the egg cells are to complete fertilization. And if there's not enough water around, they won't be able to make that journey. So we only find bryophytes living in particularly wet environments. And we'll talk more about that later. All right, let's think about the second group of plants that we're studying. This group is the seedless vascular plants. So let's first assign the name based on which generation of the plant is the dominant form. And in this plant, we're going to call them diplonic. That means the diploid form is the dominant form, and that means the sporophyte is the dominant form. So here we have a picture of a fern sporophyte. That's the part of a fern plant that we would recognize if we saw a fern growing in a plant store or in our house or wherever. The sporophyte is what we would recognize as a fern. Again, its job is to produce spores. It produces the spores in these sporangia under the leaf. The spores are released. The spores grow up through mitosis into the gametophyte. The gametophyte's very small. It's actually pretty difficult to identify and locate the gametophyte for a mature fern. All right. Again, the gametophyte's job is to produce sperm and eggs, produce gametes. They fertilize one another, and we get a zygote. So the dominant form is the sporophyte. That's the diploid form of the organism. So we call it diplonic. So again, a small gametophyte and a large sporophyte. The other detail I want us to keep track of for seedless vascular plants is that they require water for fertilization as well. So just like the bryophytes, the sperm needs to be able to swim through some water to gain access to the egg and complete fertilization. And thus, ferns and other seedless vascular plants need to inhabit relatively moist environments. All right, let's consider the gymnosperm life cycle. So here, the gymnosperm is also diplonic, meaning that its diploid form is the larger form. That's the sporophyte. So if we think about a conifer tree, the tree itself is the sporophyte. So this giant tree is the sporophyte. So again, we've got this very small gametophyte. In fact, in the gymnosperms, this gametophyte is microscopic. And then we've got a very large sporophyte. The spores for gymnosperms, they actually develop and mature inside cones. So the spores are made inside cones and they develop and mature into the gametophytes inside these cones. So cones are where the gametophytes can be found. And again, they're very small. Let's see, what else about gymnosperms? The gametophytes have a new identity. So the male gametophyte in gymnosperms is a pollen grain. So we'll be thinking about that. And the female gametophyte is an egg. So some cones produce eggs, the female cones produce eggs, and the male cones produce pollen. Pollen is used to transport over to the egg, they fertilize, and in gymnosperms, the zygotes develop into seeds. Seeds are really useful to gymnosperms because they provide nourishment for the growing zygote. Seeds provide a way for the zygote to be dispersed into the environment. And seeds allow a period of dormancy for that zygote so that it can grow up later when conditions might be better for the plant. The last thing I want to say about the pollen grain is that pollen are resistant to desiccation. Pollen don't require water for dispersal. So we've broken that link between reproduction and water in gymnosperms. All right, the last group of plants are the angiosperms. Angiosperms, just like the gymnosperms, are also diplonic. Their major form is the sporophyte, and they have a microscopic gametophyte generation. Just like the gymnosperms, their spores develop and mature in a specific structure. They develop and mature into gametophytes within, this should have said, flowers. So in the angiosperms, the gametophytes develop in flowers. Same idea here. The male gametophyte is the pollen. The female gametophyte is the egg. And those structures are found within the flower. Just like in the gymnosperms, when the pollen fertilizes an egg, we develop a zygote, and that zygote develops into a seed. Again, just like in gymnosperms, seeds provide an advantage because they provide nourishment to the growing zygote. They provide a way of dispersing the zygote, and they provide a period of dormancy for the zygote. The last thing I want to say about angiosperms is that their ovaries, where the eggs are fertilized, go through one additional step. They develop into fruit after fertilization is complete. So the ovary here will develop into a fruit that will hold the seeds, and that provides some advantages we'll speak about later. That advantage is mostly in seed dispersion. So, to end, I just want to look quickly at our phylogenetic tree for plants and remind you that we're adding some reproductive adaptations, like the reduction of gametophyte generations and getting larger sporophytes. We're talked about the development of seeds in gymnosperms and angiosperms, and then the development of flowers and fruit in angiosperms. So we're going to talk more about those details and why we separate these groups the way we do in another video. But for there, we'll end our discussion of reproductive adaptation.